Can I just ask that we don't type or make any, just reduce on the background noise?
Hello, good afternoon. We are live.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Wiza.
Welcome everybody. My name is Wiza. I am one of the organizers of the conference, and I'm your tech support / welcoming and exiting person. Just wanted to thank you all for making the time to join us today. This conversation is going to be around building a value system for Renaissance. That's a lot of English words that I don't really understand very well. Mubiana, you'll be, have I pronounced that correctly? Mubiana?
Mubiana.
Okay, Mubiana. You'll be moderating this panel. We have a great set of people who are joining you who share a bit more about themselves. But yeah, we are live now. We have over 40 people watching. I'm expecting about 50 people more to join. Please look out for any questions and interesting comments in the chat, and all the ones that you guys feel like you want to respond to. You can have that. And you can also invite specific attendees to actually join us on video if you want to do that. But yeah. I've made enough noise now. Have a great time. I'll pop back in at 5 minutes and 2 minutes in to remind you for time, and then that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Wiza.
Okay.
Nice.
Right.
Thank you.
Sanitize. Don't forget to sanitize. COVID is not over.
Thanks, Wiza.
Okay. Okay. Shall we start? Okay. Good. Well, it's afternoon here. It's 5 p.m. Hello, my name is Mubiana Kabaghe. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my name is Gyude Moore, and I'm co-founder of. Oh, sorry, there's someone.
I think your audio is.
Sorry.
I think your audio is. Yeah, I'm getting some feedback.
Oh, from me?
Yeah.
Is it better now? I don't know what that is. Is it okay?
Is someone typing?
Yeah, it's not me typing. Is it okay?
It's better.
It's better. Okay, let me just try and smooth a little bit. Okay, anyway, let us start. So, like I said, my name is Mubiana, and I'm the co-founder of Bophelo Foundation, which is a non-profit organization that looks into reducing urban inequality through. Sorry, guys, the background.
Hey.
Is that okay behind that?
Yeah. There was feedback, I think, from the speakers of the actual speakers of the other people's computers. So what I've done is I've muted everyone else except you, Mubiana. And for the rest of the panelists, when you want to talk, just unmute yourself and go ahead, and then mute yourself when you're not talking. So for now, I've muted everyone except Mubiana, and then you can carry on.
Okay, I shall start once again. Hello, everybody. My name is Mubiana, and I'm the co-founder of Bophelo Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that looks to reduce rural-urban inequality through enhancement of economic activities in the rural areas of Zambia. So today we have a panel of about 5 people, and the topic is building a value system for Renaissance. So I'll first ask that each panelist introduces themselves, and then we can go ahead from there. So could we start with you, Linda?
My name is Linda Kasonde. I am a practicing lawyer and also a civil society activist. I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, Kiki?
Mubiana, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So thank you for moderating the panel, and just a small intro. My name is Kitawa Wemo, and I run a company builder for early stage entrepreneurs, especially female founders in East Africa. And we have a huge approach to merging culture and business and how we approach the strategies that we take to market. I guess we'll have a bit more conversation around values and how that influences business.
Okay, Thank you. Vuyo?
Hi, everyone. My name is Vuyolwethu Dubese, and I am from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm a consultant in monitoring and evaluation, as well as innovation strategy. And my work is really centered around inclusion, innovation, and impact. And I've worked with organizations like the World Bank Group, your MTN, and your UCT's Graduate School of Business, and essentially all about, just inclusive innovation systems that really feed into amplifying impact across the emerging markets. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Vuyo. Gyude. Did I pronounce it right?
Yes, Gyude. Hi, everybody. Really, really great to be here. My name is Gyude Moore. I currently work at a think tank at the Center for Global Development here in Washington, D.C., where I focus on financing Africa. Before that, I was the Minister of Public Works of Liberia. And really, really, again, like I said, happy to be here today.
Okay, thank you, Gyude. So I think we're going to go straight into the questions. What roles do you think values play in society, more specifically in Africa? Anybody can go ahead to answer that question. And also, do you feel, or how do archaic values affect the modern values that we have today? Anybody to start?
Yeah. I think the trouble with the world today is that people try and create a lot more differences when really we should be talking about shared humanity. And I think with regard to humanity, there are basic values that should guide us, such as justice, freedom, respect, community, and responsibility. And these are the things that bind societies world over, not just in Africa. Of course, people's experience different things according to the context within which they live. But I think those values are fundamental to really everybody. And what's important is to humanity and dignity.
Okay.
Yeah, 100% agree with Linda. I think, when we're talking value systems, we're really talking about what I like to call the product of the intensity of the energy that you put in the effort of something that produces the perception and the security that's created. And values are really something that you don't at times notice until it interrupts with what it is that you're doing and how you live your life. And, that's essentially what you value. And I think that with the example of colonization, during colonization and even at present, white people valued oppression because it brought them the perception of being viewed as, masters of slavery said, the closest image to God. So that protected them from, Black people viewing them as equals. And that was, their perception that they valued. With corporates, they value capitalism because wealth is perceived and it's created as such. And I say this in relation to COVID-19 because we're seeing how, the perception of wealth is being shattered with companies wanting to be rescued by their governments and the security that's created constantly through exploitation. So we constantly are living in a framework of perceived values in order to, one, I think just feed into what we hold on to presently. And I think also in the near future, what it is that we're trying to transform and wanting to transform. And at the end of the day, we want to share it with those who create these common values with us. And a beautiful example of what's happening right now is with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I think you're seeing that globally, and not just, with Black lives, but with African lives as well, and other minorities that are also coming to the bench and say, hey, my life has been disrupted in, a certain manner, my values are being disrupted. How can I, hold on to what I want to have, but also want to transform and then share it with the people that share these common values, not the same at times, but these common values that we share. And I think that that's what this conversation is also about. It exhibits the value systems that we have and that we're impassioned about transforming what matters to us and to us as Africans, and what goes on in our continent.
Yeah, I think so too. And just on that point, do you feel that Western values and beliefs are interfering with, the beliefs and values of Africans, per se? Because now, sometimes you speak to our grandparents and you can totally almost not relate to what they believe. Is that because of how we've been influenced by the West, or everything that we have today? And how do you think we can preserve those values and cultures from our forefathers and bring them back to life if we feel they've become obsolete and things like that? Because I feel that another reason why we fall back as Africans is because we've kind of lost what we truly believe in. So how do we retain all these values and beliefs that our forefathers have, and how can they be applied in today's context?
Do you want me to take that, or are you giving it to Gyude?
Yeah, I can go.
Okay, I will go. I think on the question of value, it is not just the value that we develop among ourselves. It is also the value that are imputed to us. One of the ways that can you hear me? There's feedback. Okay. One of the ways. So, for example, when our interaction with the West began, their presence on the continent was presented as a civilizing nation. We were presented as a people without culture. We were presented as a people without history. We were presented as a people without values. And their presence here was supposedly to give us these values. And even though they're no longer physically here and imposing those values on us, those values created systems, and those systems continue to exist. So I think a part of it is, as we go about creating these new values, it's what we say about ourselves, how we see ourselves, how we represent ourselves. I did an interview because after the George Floyd thing happened here in the US, the Ghanaian president made a comment, the head of the AU made a comment. And I said I was very uncomfortable with official Africa getting involved with this. And the reason I said that was because the South African military beat a man to death in his yard because he missed this. And that's not a single word came from any African leader about the value about our South African life. So if we're going to talk about value, we're going to come back again about how we see ourselves, how we talk about ourselves, how we present ourselves. The Kenyan police have done significant amount of extrajudicial killings. In Nigeria, SARS, which is a unit of the police, arrest, torture, kill young Nigerians. And for some reason, it doesn't seem to bother us. The final thing I would say to this is when Cyclone Idai wiped out Beira in Mozambique, we didn't see African leaders, putting together donations to help the Mozambican people rebuild their lives. But when the Cathedral of Notre Dame got burnt in France, you had African leaders sending money into that. So a part of it, if we're going to do a renaissance, that renaissance has to begin with how we see ourselves, how we perceive ourselves, and an active rejection of how people see us and project onto us.
Yeah. Kiki, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. And yeah, I think the biggest problem that we do have as we speak about Renaissance, I think this is a topic that is very key for a lot of us Africans to have. And this is just mostly because, as Gyude has said, for a long time, it was more of that Africans didn't have a culture. We are people of no history. But it is only because the history was written by someone else. But if you read through history, you find that Africans had a deeper history than anyone else in the world. the first, the Christopher Columbus of the world is actually an African man who went around, and when they saw him, they were like, there's more out there, and they came out to look for where this man came from. And you read books about this long, really tall man who was really black and had really coarse hair, and that's an African man. And I think it's also understanding the value that came with clearing the history for the man who wanted to take over our land and take over our resources. I guess, and I always say colonialism is the best business ever, that it came with this ideal and, pushed this mindset to people who had existed before and really pushed them to wipe out what they already believed in. And I think for us to have a renaissance, a rebirth, is for us to begin to rewrite that history and be very honest with our roots as Africans, and to be able to not fight all the oppression that we have gone through with oppression. I think we need to fight it with, a rebirth of understanding our potential and understanding what our renewed understanding of our values has in the growth of our economies, in the growth of our people, and also a renewing of our strength and where we've come from. And I do owe it, and I hope that maybe the millennials and I always say Generation Z and the ones who will be born during COVID season will be the ones who will take over and, change the narrative for Africa and for the world to come.
Yeah. Thank you, Kiki, for that. Linda, do you have anything to add on this specific question? Oh, we can't hear you.
Oh, she's on mute.
Just to add on to what Gyude was saying, the reason why people were able to oppress us, or why we don't value our own lives as much, is because there's a feeling in the world that somehow we're not of equal value in ourselves. It's only until, for example, in the US, only up until 155 years ago, Black Americans were considered to be 3/5 of a human being. And dehumanizing somebody allows you to oppress. It's not that somebody has that value of oppression, for example. It's that they see you as less of a human being, so it enables them to do things that are atrocities or other forms of oppression. So once we all see ourselves as equal, whether it's other races seeing ourselves as equal or ourselves valuing our own worth as Africans or even our own race, that's when values will transcend whatever background you have. So I think that the foundation is to value all humanity as being equal.
Yeah. I want to just pick up on what Linda said about, the stakeholders who are participating in Africa, in the African Renaissance, and current participants in the economy as well. And that is to also hold people, accountable who are not just Africans or of the African diaspora, the people who benefit from who and what Africa is, right? And I think that in order for us to, have this shared value creation, it can't just be a one-way value creation transaction, as we've seen, with the relationship, between Africa and China and those relations. But I think that as much as we do our own promotion of how proud we are to be Africans and how proud, we are of the products that come out of Africa, there is a narrative that your United Nations are playing with the ads and all of these other sort of negative stereotypes that are coming through that are really filling in those gaps and holding on to, carrying the message of this is what Africa is and this is what Africa values. So that promotional element as well, I think it's something that we need to invest in and hold not only ourselves, but those who look from the outside in and are actually in and benefiting more than we are, and just hold them accountable to say that the type of promotion that you're doing is not what we're speaking of right now in this particular panel discussion, right? So I think that that's something that we really need to connect to, whereas it's us telling our own stories through a Netflix or it's through the tweeting or whatever mediums and funnels that we're using to relate these stories. One of my favorite books that I read think it was early this year or late last year, was by a tech entrepreneur, Mushambi Muduma, and he wrote a book called, what's the name of the book? I'll drop it in the comments, but Tech Adjacent. Yes, Tech Adjacent. And what the book does is that in the book, he narrates, what you were talking about, Gyude, in that, sorry, I think it was Kiki. You were talking about, the renaissance that Africa had pre-colonization, and what we valued, and what was coming out of this continent, and how important that is to continue to narrate. And I think if we have the books and we have the mediums of the internet, the mediums of traditional media to be able to relay those stories, I think it'll reverberate much, much more and amplify this impact that we're trying to say that this is what Africa is and this is what we value. And if you want to come on board, you actually got to get yourself right and narrate the beauty that there is, and share this common. We talk about common value systems, are not necessarily the same value systems, but why, it's so important for us to share this common value systems as we're communicating in it.
Okay, thank you for that, Vuyo. Just speaking on the same, how then do we reduce rural-urban inequality? So we're speaking about this whole new African Renaissance, but then how do we integrate people in the rural areas? I mean, we are here, we have our laptops on and things like that. We're connected to the internet, but how do we then integrate our brothers and sisters in the rural area, and how do we empower them and reduce the economic imbalance, so to speak, between the rich and the poor in Africa? That is.
Yes. So it takes not only us innovators and entrepreneurs and citizens to be able to do that, but it takes the government, right? It takes the government and it takes the people to be able to create these explicit, inclusive policies and interventions that can actually involve stakeholders who do not have the AirPods that we have or the internet that we have to be able to actually participate in the bills that are being taken up or vote in any policies that are coming out. And I think that there needs to be also this promotion of these participants as well, because what happens sometimes is that it trickles down from a top-down approach when these policies are being created or when these systems are about to be implemented, that I think, coming from a country that has, the highest Gini coefficient and the highest inequality gap in the world, I see that and I live that, right? So it's important that, from a language perspective, right? Sometimes it's not just the internet. People actually do have a phone. I can tell you right now that my mother has a phone with internet, but she does not know how to navigate it. If she gets an SMS and she's on WhatsApp, she is fine, right? But I think it comes with the education. It comes with, breaking down the language barriers so that people who are, there is that community-based and context-based approach that trickles from the bottom up as well, so that we can get a really inclusive people that are participating in this. And I think just two last points in that is that the reinvestment of the research and development in social sciences, right? Because that is so important. The data doesn't lie, right? And I think that to my last point, if you develop measurable goals to be able to reduce these inequalities that exist, because you need to be able to monitor these interventions that you are implementing so that you're able to evaluate what it is that we're doing right, because we can implement acts here and there. But the point is, if we don't know where the money is going, we don't know how the money is actually enabling the potential reduction of inequalities, then the whole point of conducting this society or this renaissance that we're wanting to actively be a part of, it can't essentially manifest and transform.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, Gyude.
During the war in Liberia, I must have been around 14 years old or 13. My father and I, we went to the village and we were about to leave. Early in the morning, we went to see the high priest of the town. And in the morning, before the sun came up, we stood on this rock, and he turned toward the rising sun and began to invoke our ancestors to say, here are your children as they go forth. You should be with them. But when I was 13 and 14, I lived my entire life in a city, in a town, and I didn't really appreciate what was happening, what he was doing. But a part of the reason why our communities remained the way they were was because it was this unending, our culture was that even though people are dead and they've departed, they remain with us, they're watching over us, they protect us, they gave us a good harvest, they allow us, if we cheat, they see us, and they're gonna punish us for cheating. If we lie, they see us. If we hurt others, they see us. There's deep value in the rural parts of Africa remain the repositories of our culture and our values. But for some reason, we've placed such significant measure of value on living in cities that we don't actually value where our culture is actually being kept and practiced. So I think for creators, for me, I'm at a think tank and I write and I talk, but for you who are creating, I think what is important is for us to be able to find a way, not only to simply capture our culture and a part of our culture that we can pass on to others who come after us, but and the example I'll use with myself is my daughter, my children were born here. And if I don't take my children to Liberia, if I don't take my children there and let them learn about this, with me, that knowledge will die. So I think it's very, very important for us to be able to do that. And I think the government does have a role in that. The final thing that I would say, though, as we embrace our culture, we need to recognize that cultures evolve. And there are things in our culture that should not be, that should not remain. Part of our culture is oppressive of women. Part of our culture is oppressive of young people. When I was appointed Minister of Public Works, I was 37 years old, and the Senate refused to commit to confirm me because they said the boy is too small for the job. We live on a continent where youth is seen as a weakness, and young people ought to be seen and not heard. And that part comes from our culture, where I think we should respect the elderly, but youth also have a significant role to play in leadership. So I think it is a combination of all these things, preserving the parts of our culture that we want to pass on to our children, but also excising our culture of parts that are very oppressive to units within our groups. And I will stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Linda?
We can't hear you. I hear you. Yeah.
Throw the question back in terms of cultures being dynamic. So often culture is weaponized against people to stop them from speaking out or from doing something. So how do we do that? How do we keep the best and ensure that those parts of our culture that are not useful or are detrimental to us, and who decides which parts those are? It's a very, very tricky situation, because so often when people try and raise those conversations, they're considered uncultured or just trying to speak ill of their own culture. So how do we maintain that balance?
I have two points to that. The first one is something I noticed when I started going to South Africa. When you go to South Africa, it might happen in other African countries, but I noticed it in South Africa. When you go to South Africa around the holiday season, like Christmas, all of the towns are empty because people go back to on a Friday evening. You see people going back to their village, going back to for big holidays, people make an attempt to go back to their towns and the places they come from. And so because of that, there's a constant connection between even the cities and the rural areas. But I'll give you an example in terms of how we changed that with Liberia. When President Sirleaf, I guess because she was a woman, when she became president, one of the things that she did was she began to appoint women to council. And when she went into villages, when she went into the village and the men were seated on one side and the woman was seated on one side, she didn't try to disrupt that, but she ensured that everybody in that meeting spoke up. And so it became a part of, so the culture, in a very subtle way, the culture changed. Even when she was no longer present, when they went to meetings, women were allowed to offer an opinion. And we included something called the County Development Fund. And the County Development Fund, the entire county had to decide how the money was used. But that decision was, they had it as something called a county sitting. And at the county sitting, there were women, there were youth, and there were the men. And every single person had to have a voice in how they did it. Because it was the same thing of, the traditional African society of people sitting together to make a decision. But this time, we made slight tweaks to it in terms of voices and who can be heard. So I think a part of the thing you're talking about is when we join white people to spit on our culture, to condemn the entire culture, to say it's barbaric, there's something demonic about it, and wholesale, cursing our own culture. I think that's what people talk about. So there is definitely a balance to be kept, but I think we can, and that comes from, I'm speaking from the government side because that's where I come from, in the government. You too, who are as an academic or as a creator, you too have a role to play in being able to do this. But I think there are changes that we can be able to make, and those changes can be long. Sorry, I think that's all.
Thanks for that, Gyude.
I think just to throw a little bit of a spanner in the wheel, I think there's a certain element of education that has brought a huge detriment to how we view our values as Africans and our value as our social values. So you find that the more you get educated, the more you want to distance yourself from your culture and westernize yourself more, and then only until you get faced by racism or a certain form of oppression is then when you run back to your social values and say, well, I'm African and this is I'm being disadvantaged by policy, by governments, by people, by society. So how then can we, the educated people, actually bridge the gap that exists? Just to answer your question, when you're talking about the rich and the poor and how can we bridge the gap that exists between the two worlds, I think the gap already just exists because of how well educated most people are and how that automatically means that you should be less African now that you have an education. So how can we honestly have that conversation as young people, as educated Africans, and not really fall back only when the West doesn't accept us anymore, and then we run back to Africa and ask for a renaissance?
I'm just going to add just a quick point to what Linda is asking Gyude. I think that when to his point, when you do have the education and you do realize that something isn't right. For instance, something like FGM, that doesn't seem right, at least to my values, but to another culture, that is what they value, and that is they value the oppression of women, right? In my culture, I'm Xhosa, which is a tribe in South Africa, and one of the traditions in the culture is that when young men from the age of like at least 17 plus, they go to the bush, they get circumcised, and school of manhood and the whole shebang. But what has been happening, and particularly in the hub, or where there's this majority of Xhosa people in a province in South Africa called the Eastern Cape, where a lot of these traditions are taking place, is that there's been the mortality rate has been soaring over the years because of the safety that has not been implemented in some parts of the Eastern Cape and some parts of Cape Town as well. So when there is that safety hazard that's taking place, then there's, the other option of you could either do it traditionally or you could go to hospital and let the doctor do it to you, right? But then there's that emasculation element that comes from the wider, Xhosa men, and that's you're not man enough. You're not able to handle going to the bush or staying, outdoors for, a couple of weeks. So there's definitely that fear, and the short-term immediate consequence is that you definitely will be ostracized, right? If you're trying to implement something, if you're trying to introduce a new way of thinking or a new way of doing culture, because the sad thing about how, as Africans, how we view culture is that it should stay as is, right? It shouldn't evolve as culture does. So short term, there definitely is that ostracizing that takes place, but I think long term it is about the inclusivity and mobilizing people to actually recognize that it is good, and we don't want to eliminate everything that's good about the culture, because that's what it's part of our DNA in terms of what makes us proud to be Africans, right? So I think that it's definitely recognizing that there is an opportunity to change, and being real, and in recognizing that it's fearful to want to try and change something and do something new, especially if you're not a president, right? But if you're an ordinary person and you're recognizing that this is wrong, but it's still my culture and I still love it, but it's not what I value, and that doesn't mean that I'm demonized or I need the prayer of God or whatever. But I think it's just recognizing that once you do have the education, there's also a certain way that you want to impart this knowledge so that it doesn't harm, but at the end of the day, actually preserve what it is that you love about your culture.
Thank you for that. We're just adding on to what Kiki mentioned. I think it's very important that
Mubiana, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? I think Linda, you could.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Kiki, can you hear me now? Hello. What's happening now? Oh, okay. I see. So I think it's important that we include and integrate the people in the rural area. Why I say this is because, when you look at the status quo at the moment, most people in the rural area are getting help through this so-called aid from the West, you see, and most of it is basically just making them more dependent of handouts and things like this. But for a new African Renaissance, I think for us educated people that have been enlightened and exposed, a lot of us have traveled and things like that. It is important to go back and first of all learn the culture, because you just don't go back and try to impose things on people and they actually don't understand what you're trying to do. But it's best to go back, understand the culture, understand where we come from, and try to integrate the two together. Firstly, we have issues of hunger. Before we could, bring up any innovative ideas on how we can integrate these people into what we're trying to do, is to first, feed these people, see how they can have food security, and then go a stage higher. And so to speak, I think it's many times we just forget that there are actually other Africans out there other than us, in the urban setup. And it's important that we as Africans all join forces together and go ahead. And why this is important is because the people in the rural area actually have more understanding of our culture than we do in the urban area. So they're definitely part and parcel of this new African Renaissance that we're trying to bring into existence and just go forward. Just going to the next question, how do you think education affects our value system? Because, for example, I'm from Zambia here, and most of our education lies in, with the British syllabus and things like that. How do you think this then affects our value system and the way we think? And like Linda said before, was it Gyude, how we actually perceive ourselves as Africans? Because from what we learn in the textbooks, everything is not based on Africa. It's based on what's out there in the West. And how then can we, come out of that, or possibly come up with our own syllabuses that promote Africa as it should be, and document history and everything that has happened in the past? Maybe we can go with Linda.
I think that the first thing that we need to eliminate, and I don't know so much about whether it's an education thing or a socialization thing within our families, that people who speak a certain way are ignorant, or if the official language is English, for example, and they can't speak it that well or communicate that well in that language, then they're not intelligent. That's a very pervasive view in Zambia, and it goes back to what you're saying about how we see ourselves. Firstly, as having worth and as being as good and even better than other, or potentially better than other cultures. Just that, and instilling that sense in ourselves, starting from the family unit, and then going in with that sense of confidence as we are being educated, so we're able to sieve for ourselves what we think is useful and what we don't think is useful, because that is the purpose of education. It's you thinking, it's giving yourself the power to think for yourself. So I think that's what our education needs to encourage more. And a lot of our education here is about rote learning rather than teaching people how to think. So I think that's the place to start, so that people can choose for themselves how they want to conduct their lives and how they want to experience the world.
Okay. Gyude, do you have any point on that?
Two quick points. When the case here in the U.S. that allows schools to integrate, Brown versus the Board of Education, one of the arguments that was made in that case was an experiment that was done with little black girls. They were offered a blonde doll and a black doll. And after years of dehumanization, most of the little black girls refused to accept the black doll because they thought it was ugly, and they wanted the blonde doll because they thought it was pretty. And I think the way people think of themselves, I keep coming back to that, how we think of ourselves is really, really important. And one of the ways that we can do that in our education system is to actually begin to teach African history. I don't know as much of the great Southern African or Eastern African empires, but I know of Great Zimbabwe. I know in West Africa, we had 3 massive empires. In fact, 2 West African countries get their name from those empires. Ghana gets its name from the Ghana Empire. Mali gets its name from the Mali Empire. Songhai was the largest of those empires, the Benin Empire in what is now Nigeria. And for some reason, these things are taught to African children, but they're not taught to African children. African people learn these things by themselves. And what we learn is we learn Greek history. We learn about the Romans. And all of these things continue to elevate Western history and the sources of Western history and sort of demean what is African history. So I think first we need to begin to attack our self-perception in the history that we convey to our people. It's important to tell our children and our children's children that we too descend from great people who created great empires in the past. And the reason, because a person who doesn't see, it's like those little girls who refuse to accept the black dolls, the dolls that look more like them, they refuse to accept. And they took the ones that, because they were presented with an ideal of what is beautiful. So I think education plays a very significant role in doing that. The final thing that I would say here is the disruption that occurred in Africa has affected our trust system. I think while we talk about the good things in our culture and the good things that are happening on the continent, there's not going to be any renaissance if we continue not to trust each other and not to be worthy of trust. I have businesses back home. I have businesses that have failed because people are untrustworthy. If you're living in the diaspora and trying to run a business back home, finding people who are trustworthy to be able to do it is probably some of the most difficult things, even your family members. So if there's going to be some sort of renaissance where we're going to rebuild ourselves, part of it is we have to rebuild that trust. I don't know how we do that, but this perception of Africa being inherently too risky for people to invest in, what feeds into that negative narrative is the negative experiences of people, even Africans, who are trying to invest on the continent. So I'll just go back to my points is that, one, we really, really need to pay attention to what we're teaching our children. And we definitely need to go back to be able to rediscover what it means for us to maintain that trust among ourselves, because without that trust, it's difficult for us to build wealth. It's difficult for us to build the kinds of prosperous societies that are necessary for us to move our continent forward.
I want to pick up on what Gyude was talking about. About the halves, right? And I think as children, there's not really much that we actually controlled. But as adults, again, I'll go back to having these conversations that we're having. And I think also connecting with people who are living in Africa, people who are in the diaspora and are overseas, and people who are wanting to have some sort of relationship and investment with Africa. And one, learning from them and also teaching them how the reality, right, and what it is that is actually going on this continent. And I think also being intentional about consuming the content, consuming the information of what it is that you're wanting to communicate, right? So it's important that we read the books, that we read the stories, or that we watch the movies. But I think also when we're talking about, a Netflix or a Black Panther and all of these stories and narratives that give us this boost, some things are inaccurate, right? And I think that what I'm really appreciative of how particularly Black people, when Africans are consuming content, is that the behind the scenes people, the cast and crew, who's writing these stories, who's directing these stories is just as important, right? Because the narrative and the perception that's being held is so important to how that communication of what it is that we're valuing is sort of funneled into the education element, the education panel of what it is that we're doing. So I think we really have to be intentional about the kind of content that we're consuming and who we're connecting to, and the kind of information that we're relaying as a people, as these Africans who are wanting a particular value system to be elevated and a particular perception to be had, so that, as you're saying, Gyude, people can actually want to invest in Africa, and not just be known as, for being risky or risk avert for wanting to invest on the continent. So I think it's also up to us to just be intentional about what it is that we're consuming, and what we're putting out there for the world to actually consume and perceive and value about what and who Africa is.
Thank you for that, Vuyolwethu. Okay, so just the last question for today on this topic. Then, do you think Africa should have a common value system? I mean, Africa is a huge, diverse continent that has different cultures, religion, and values per se. But do you think it's possible to have a common value system across the board where we all agree to say we are united, this is the direction we're taking, this is us, this is Africa? What do you think about that?
If I may. Oh, you're going to ask Kiki. Okay.
Yeah, I seem to be having some issues with my devices.
Okay, Linda, you can go ahead.
I hope you can.
I was going to say, linking the previous point to this point, if you're going to have an African Renaissance, then what you need to encourage is, as people are saying in the chat, us writing our own stories. And just linking that to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's point of the day, applies to us telling our own stories. We can't all have the same story. We're very different in our own different ways. And we need to sell those stories. And more importantly, we need to get our people educated to read those ideas, because it's only when we have that marketplace of ideas flourishing that we get access to the best possible solutions to whatever challenges that we're facing on the continent. And that necessarily involves a diversity of thought. So that's really what we need to be encouraging: intellectualism, academic excellence, homegrown.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I'll just pipe in. I'm back. I just had to fix whatever is going on. I think Africa is actually making good strides towards having a shared common value system. And it's really good that we are going back to our roots, because we had a common value system. And I listen to, like, now with media, I can watch South African shows, I can watch movies from Nigeria, and sometimes I can hear dialogue that sounds the same, and that just tells me that we are the same people. Only that borders were created by someone who decided that we need to have a Tanzania and a Zambia and a South Africa and a Kenya. But in truth, we are one people. And so it's good to see that our leaders actually take steps, especially when you look at trade, the fact that we have a free trade agreement that should, I think they're beginning negotiations in a few weeks. I think we're making steps. And the only thing that I might add is just implementation is always the biggest African problem. That we have all these great policies, we have all these smart people who can come up with the best, piece of paper to say that this is what we want to do to change Africa, but we never really implement it. So it's up to us to kind of hold people accountable to the policies that we choose to pass for our value system. And so we just need to be a little bit more for intense, and I put that in quotes. But then, so I think we are working towards having that.
So there is a big conversation that
Kiki, I think there's feedback coming from
you, Kiki. I think there's a big competition that occurs in West Africa, and if anybody has followed West Africa online, you have seen our war on jollof rice. And there's Nigerian jollof, there's Ghanaian jollof, every West African country does a version of the jollof. And it is in that variety that we're able to get the best. So the idea that there should be a common, the European Union is an economic union, but that doesn't stop it from having French and Poles and British. I think we're all unique in our ways. And so it is possible for us to create a common market in terms of an African continental free trade agreement, but for us we can continue to maintain our individuality as West Africans or East Africans or Southern Africans, for us to be able to do that. And I think this, it's hard to talk about Africa. It's hard to talk about 54 individual units. And so we get bogged down in this thing where we talk about Africa. But even if you were to go to the smallest African country, the amount of variety you're going to encounter, is insane. So to imagine that on a continent that is so diverse, even at that an entire continent will be unitary in terms of what its values are, is going to be really, really hard. So I agree that we should continue in whatever space we find ourselves. Eventually, there's going to be a number of things on which we agree. But there are also going to be certain differences, and those differences Japan is completely different from China, and China is different from Korea, even though there are things that they share. And nobody's asking them to have a single Asian value system, or asking Europeans to have a single one. And so what people do not demand of themselves, we're not going to demand of ourselves, and we're not even going to allow other people to put us in that position as this is something that we're supposed to do. But it's been incredible being on here with these amazing women and the people in the chat room.
I love the, I think for me, just to round up, I love the reference that we've been using of the free trade agreement, because I think that's a great example of adjacent or, a common value system that we as Africans, have. We, wanting to create the shared value of economic empowerment, of, just plowing supply chain of trade back into Africa through a single market for goods and services, the free movement of persons and investment, and so much more. I see we're sanitizing. I'm going to sanitize real soon. But what I really want to highlight is that there's a reason why, Eritrea is the only country that's not signed to the agreement. And there's many, speculation about why or why not. But their values is, it's not as adjacent, or it's not common to what it is that we're, or the other 54 countries are actually wanting to achieve. So I think for me, when we're talking about a common value system or an adjacent value system, we really need to, be really hard on not only ourselves as the citizens, but also recognizing that Africa needs a government that prides itself in its commitment to serving its citizens, as we've seen them, doing so diligently during the COVID pandemic, as much as they do in criminalizing homophobia. We need a common value system that has brought us together through this conference, where we share common values, and that is in seeing Africa's impact amplified through inclusive innovation, And something that I really want to put out to the conference is for us to actually draw up a shared value system. What is the shared value system that you have for the African Renaissance, right? I saw, through a couple of tweets that they were looking for women. Clearly, it wasn't a part, I don't know, I'm maybe assuming here, but including women from the get-go wasn't a part of their values in this. It was something that came as an afterthought, right? So it needs to be embedded in the values of this conference that I need to have women as a part of the first people that are coming up, and not something that we're worrying about a week or 2 weeks later to the actual conference. So that's something that, through this conversation, I've really, really enjoyed connecting with you. But also, if we're coming back next year, let's come back with something that says, this is what we value as a conference, and this is what we value as a people, and this is how we're being intentional about putting out products. 2 minutes, please. All right. About putting out products that actually shape what Africa and the future of Africa, that it is adjacent to either the countries or the diasporas where we're actually operating in. So that's my piece. Thank you so much for the opportunity to connect with each and every one of you. I definitely will be after this. And I've seen some comments in the panel comment section, and I'll be reaching out and connecting there as well. So thank you so much to the team.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of our discussion, and I just want to say thank you to all the panelists that we have had today. Kiki, I don't know where you're at. Thank you for coming as well and giving us your time. Linda, thank you so much. And Gyude, thank you. Wiza, thank you so much for organizing this. You were great. And like Vuyo said, I hope we come back next year with some more solutions. And actually, I hope some work could have been done already, because we've spoken about so many things. And I hope we can actually, put some of these things into practice. Yeah. All right. Oh, Kiki, I was just giving some finishing remarks. Closing remarks.
Hello, I was just going to say, apart from having common value system across Africa, we need better internet. So can we just all work?
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's been absolutely great having this conversation with you guys. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Sorry to cut you guys short. Just keeping the time here. Thank you for making the time. Before I go, I want to address Vuyo's point about how do we have more inclusive spaces for women, like in conference. We started this out as like a random idea to just have like a Zoom thing, and we put together everything in a space of like 2 weeks. And I think what we failed to do very well was being intentional about making sure that women are included from the get-go. But I'm proud that we managed to identify that as an issue and course correct before actually coming to the event. So now we have about 6 out of 20 women on the planning team, and we have absolutely no manuals. So I think that's a bit of progress.
I also want you to consider other minorities, right? That are being represented, that lack representation, particularly in these types of conferences, right? So talking to, people who are living with disabilities and how their sort of contribution and how they are participants in this renaissance, and how the internet or technology has enabled them to do this, or is lacking, the opportunity for them to do this. So considering other minorities as well. And again, it could be something that you guys are drawing up, put it out to all the participants or everyone who's attended, if they want to contribute, and then just sign up a charter, ARC charter, the value system, ARC charter, I don't know. But it's really something that hopefully we can consider, and I'd love to come back next year and hold all of us accountable. So goodbye.
Definitely.
All right, goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.